This is something, I think it was actually Armin that helped trigger this. A couple of years ago, we were working together, and he said a common problem that often happens is like all these teams writing these React components, and then they write their tests, and it's really, really hard. And so I had sort of been thinking about this, and there's this library called Testing Library, and it sort of led to this mindset of accessibility first testing. And then I've sort of branched out into, okay, what if you do all your development like that? And this is like an ideal, of course, I'm a consultant when I'm doing projects. I'm not doing this all the time. That's life. But yeah, let's jump into it. So if we look at what we're going to cover here, we've got landmarks, which are the main building blocks of a web page. Within that web page, it's then broken up into content and structure. So you just think of that as like your everyday HTML elements. And then you've got these newfangled things called widgets that help you build apps. And then so with this sort of structure, that makes it accessible to assistive technology, but also those affordances are accessible to your tests that you are writing. And so you can actually use the same sort of language and same affordances to write your tests as assistive technology would use. So to start off with landmarks, if you look at a city, you'll notice that here's Paris, and there's a whole bunch of landmarks, like the Eiffel Tower and the Notre Dame and so forth. And so when you go to a different city, you often have these unique landmarks, like, only one city has the Eiffel Tower. But you also have, there's museums, there's churches, there's parks, there's the town square. And so you have this sort of mix between landmarks that are familiar that you'd expect to find in a city and landmarks that are totally unique. And so if I go to Paris, one of the things that this unique landmarks helps me do is orient myself in that space. And so I can walk around Paris and then I see the Eiffel Tower in the distance and I go, oh yeah, just yesterday it was this far away. And now I'm closer, and it helps me get familiar with this unfamiliar space. So you have these landmarks help you explore a place. And so they also provide, so here's a picture of London. They also provide familiar places that they can return to. So I'm going to show a website here, one that you're probably familiar with, GitHub's new repo page. And so if you look here, there's actually certain landmarks that are familiar. There's usually a header at the top. There's usually a footer with these small little links. There's usually the main part of the page. And so there's actually a extension that you can use for Firefox and Chrome and so forth that help you see these landmarks. These are part of the ARIA and related specs. And so you can, with that extension, you can see, okay, there's the site search, there's the global navigation, there's what their name for the header is the banner, there's a form, there's the links at the bottom. And so I've highlighted two here, but effectively there are 8 landmarks. You've got the primary content on the page, you've got navigation, you've got this thing they call the banner, which we usually just think of as the main header. We've got a form that can be used for searching on the page. I've got other forms, we've got legal links and so forth, the stuff at the bottom, and so forth. And so these are used by assistive technology to go, I just want to jump to the main content. I don't want to have to go through all the links in the header because it's going to be speaking it out loud. I'm on the Stripe homepage and it's going to start speaking through from top to bottom. I just want to be able to jump straight to the navigation. I want to jump straight to the search. So these landmarks effectively act as touchstones that they can navigate. They can go to a completely new page and they can expect to find these familiar elements on the page. And so if we look at another page you're probably familiar with is Wikipedia. And so if we use that extension, you'll see again, they've used the correct markup that we had on the right here. And so it appears correctly. And so you can see on the left here, we've got actually 5 different navigations. You can give each navigation a name. And so they can directly jump to, say, the tools navigation. And so they, they need to upload a file. So they can go jump directly to there and then jump directly to that link. So by using these base landmarks, so there's not too much work to do this. We can really start to make our pages more accessible. Next, if we go like a level deeper, we've got what I just call content roles. So, it's like your traditional HTML. So links, headings, lists, articles, and so forth, images, all of that sort of stuff. And so again, this helps user have some context of what they're actually hearing. And so they, if they've been spoken, what's the content on the page, they want to know, that link needs to, it's sort of like a narration on the page. It gives them, it helps them continue to navigate, otherwise they become stuck. I think, Tom Stones, I think I can just hear your background noise. So moving on from content, so content's sort of just static, and then we've got our interactive widgets. So you think of, something like Gmail, which is really innovative in, I think, 2004, and you start to get these apps that are really rich and interactive and start to do push HTML. And so there's this wonderfully named, it sounds like the name of Borat film, Web Accessibility Initiative, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And so that lets you do controls like, inputs, checkboxes, tabs, sliders, and even stuff like calendars. So they don't provide an implementation of all of these things. So some of them, obviously, input type equals text is built into most web, all web browsers, but there's not really a calendar widget. But they do provide a specification of how you should probably build this thing. And so again, here's a slide of these different controls and an example of the HTML that you use there. So I just highlighted one here, status. So the role is called status. And the HTML that you would use for that is output, which I find really interesting because it's the opposite of input. And so if you've got a form and then as you do stuff on the page, you're going to show the user some sort of result, you'd use that output thing. And so it's probably like a lot of these patterns, we just sort of know when we're doing UI design or when we're implementing something, we've sort of got this pattern already in our head, but it sort of turns out that these patterns are actually in a specification that you can use. So here on the page, here's the actual spec. WAI ARIA, and then here's all the full list of widget roles that they support. So one note to keep in mind is that no ARIA is actually better than bad ARIA. So you should first, if you want to implement a button, there is it breaks down exactly. If you wanted to implement a custom button, you could do that, and you can do this example here of div role equals button. But there's actually a lot that the built-in button provides for you that you would have to then re-implement. And so you want to make sure you really just stick to the default. If there's already a built-in way of doing something, just use that and then just style it rather than trying to customize the whole thing. But there is stuff like a autocomplete widget that it's not built in, so you will have to build that, and it's often a bit of a pain. So the framing of how I think about this is again an ideal. I'm not saying it's going to be perfect, but this is a standards-based way to build components, test components, and then test drive components. So if you're doing TDD, if you're trying to think of write your test first, you can actually use these accessibility roles to know what's going to be on the page. So you can almost think of it as like a screen reader user and what they would expect to hear, and then go and do your implementation. And so it really helps you sort of separate those two things, and the test can be a lot simpler. So here's an example from the spec. It's like listing like every single role. So you can see that a without an href doesn't have a role, but an A with an href has the role of link implicitly. So you can, if you use a tool to find that, you can say, hey, give me all the links on the page, and it'll find all of them. And you can see there's an algorithm here as well to go, okay, for these input type elements. So on the left here, there's an algorithm to know how does this thing provide an accessible name, and there's basically an algorithm that steps through. Okay, I'm going to try this ARIA label attribute. Okay, if that doesn't exist, I'm going to check if there's a label element that it's associated with. If that doesn't exist, I'm going to look at the title attribute. If that doesn't exist, I'm going to look at the placeholder, and so forth. And so you can see there's a lot of flexibility here of how this gets provided. And so this is where I'm saying like you can write your test first in this way that just expects to find an input with this accessible name, but then how that's implemented can be totally, be very, very abstract. And one other thing here is that this is a spec. So HTML it's an amazing technology. It's very ugly in a lot of ways, but it's been around for 30 years, and in 30 more years, it's probably still going to be around. And that's the beauty of it. It's not like one technology like Vue or React or Angular. In 30 years, all those technologies will be completely dead and gone. No one will use them. But these specifications have to be future-proof. They can't break existing websites. So they have to, you can sort of, there's a level of stability there that you can rely on. And so if you code against this spec, you can have confidence that it's not going to just be fragile. So here's a bunch of testing libraries that help you write these tests. They all sort of have this testing library DOM that underpins them all. There's an Angular specific one here, Spectator, that Tom will know about. There's also, if you use stuff like Cypress or Puppeteer or Playwright, there's versions of that for that as well. So one thing that can be tempting in tests is to use these like test IDs to quickly find something on the page. I recommend you not to do that. So yeah, try to use these accessibility affordances to write the test, because it's more testing the actual behavior, and that's what a good test should really do. And if you have a test ID, it's probably not really doing TDD. So I'm just trying to cut some of this stuff down. There's a lot of content here. So I've already sort of said this part. HTML and ARIA are stable, consistent specifications. Third-party libraries are unstable implementations that will change. So here's some examples of some tests. So you can say, hey, get this thing with the label of name, and I expect that thing to be valid. And that can just be one line in your test. And then on the right side, here's an example of how you might implement that. So I'll just provide these slides after, you can have a look at them. But what I'm trying to show here is it's like quite a high level language. It's just like how users might think of stuff. I get this thing with this label, expect that thing to be valid, invalid, checked, and so forth. And so there's like a language here that that's quite intuitive. Here's some more. So like I think the HTML elements, the HTML5 elements, they're kind of confusing. Like you came up with these things like aside and article and section, and it's like, when the hell do I use, what do these things mean? Like they're sort of interchangeable. Like how is a aside different from just a div? And so these, you can use say article example, for example, to be like a product on a page or a comment or a blog post. It's sort of these larger items. And so I could write a test that says, how many articles are there on the page? And I can infer that to mean there's 3 comments shown there. And there's sort of like there's this way of these common patterns that you'll just use and go, okay, for this sort of thing, I'm probably going to use this article. For this sort of thing, I'm going to use a status. For this thing, I'm going to use a text box. And so there's these, that's where I say it's deterministic. You can sort of like predict what role something will have. So there's a bunch of different queries that you can do. There's a bunch of different matches that you can do. That's from those code examples. Here's the full list of them. So there's not too many of them. I usually use by role first, but you can also use by label text and so forth. So if we zoom out, this is where I'm trying to say, like, first to do this earlier. At the design stage, it's, the designer will come up with the mock-up, and then it's fair. It's just a picture really, and you can make a prototype. But um, when you actually implement it, that's when you often find, is this thing accessible? What are we trying to do here? How is this actually going to work? And so I encourage you, if you have a mock-up, try to, like that way at the beginning there where we're mapping out the landmarks, try and map this stuff out as soon as possible and go, okay, that's probably going to be a banner. This thing's probably going to be a main. Those things might be articles. This thing's probably going to be the status. And start to think of what that design would look like from an accessibility point of view. And so you can, if you do that, you can, hopefully catch these problems earlier. And rather than, which I think is really unfortunate, like you implement a design and then you go, oh, let's do an accessibility pass. Let's try and make this accessible. And then it's like you have to rewire stuff and rethink stuff, and it's very expensive. So if you start to do this earlier, it can just be far simpler. And because there is just a finite spec, it's not like this endless thing. And it's a spec, it changes slowly. So if you learn these landmarks and these different roles, there's not too much here to learn. So one of the problems, like with the design system, is that coming up with names for things is really hard. Coming up with component names is really hard. What do I call this? A drop down? Do I call it a select? Do I call it an autocomplete? Do I call it what do I call it? And so if you use these names from the specs, some of them are kind of clumsy, but you can actually I encourage you just to steal those names and just go, okay, this is our combo box. And then you know exactly what accessibility role it's providing. And so also I think a good question, in our design system is like, well, okay, you give me a list of components, but what role does this have? Like I can see the preview, I can interact with it, but from accessibility point of view, what does the screen reader user see? What would they experience? And I think our design system should start to show this stuff. I think one interesting thing I've been exploring is maybe you could even output what exactly the text of the screen reader would speak to a user. I think that would be really interesting. And maybe VoiceOver is going to say this, and another program is going to use this. And it's not just the visual representation that's the output. And so if you start to organize your naming around the standard, you have a shared language like domain-driven design. You have a shared language that you can share across from your design system with designers, your tests when you write them, and then your implementation as well, like when you actually decide to write that component. So question here is, your product manager or your team or, business leaders or developers might ask, why should we bother doing this? And so the question, you could flip it around, is like, why not just make for everyone? So there's a slide coming up that will show maybe accessibility is more than who you just normally think of, but I encourage you to educate yourself, like learn this stuff. There's some books you can read, such as this one, A Web for Everyone. The web is sort of this technology that can be used by, it's the cockroach that won't die. You can have these big tech titans and they'll want to push their app stores and do their different things and VR headsets, but the web will always be there. And so the web is this thing that can be used by the most amount of people possible in the world. And it's often like the last resort, like the website, everything has a website now. So if more people can use that website, that's a good thing. I encourage you to educate your designers. So try and get the product to be more accessible at the design stage. Try to get accessibility basics in scope. If you get the hang of it, often it doesn't take any longer. And in fact, I think it makes running those Wiley front-end tests a bit easier. So these sort of people with disabilities are not who you normally might think of. This is from Microsoft. So there's like 3 columns here: permanent, temporary, and situational. So you might think of, oh, we're making for people who are in the permanent column here. But you might be, depending on your situation, you might be impaired in some way. So there's an example here of someone with one arm, and then the temporary version of that might be someone just injured their arm and they can't, they've got a sore wrist, or they can only type with one hand for a few weeks. And so they become suddenly part of this, they benefit from this work as well. Or there's a new parent, they're holding a kid and they can only, just move the mouse around. So, there's an example there of a distracted driver, probably not your target market, but, someone on a tram or something like that, this with mobile devices now, a lot of, if you can try and make that app or website usable by one hand, just with your thumb, that's a really good goal to have in mind is, can I just standing up, holding a pole with one hand, can I fill out this form? Can I just fill it all out in 5 minutes just with my thumb? So I'm not going to proclaim that I'm an expert at this. There's a few things that I need to get better at myself. I want to learn how to use screen readers themselves more. I think one of the ironies is that I don't find them that accessible. They're confusing. And the people that are doing this really well, they do usability testing with people that have disabilities. So if you can start to, put what you're making in front of people and go, okay, how's someone with this particular impairment actually how do they find this experience? That obviously will make a far better experience. So little push, here I'm writing some content, components.guide. I'm writing about the stuff. It's just all free. It's takes a lot of effort to write stuff, but yeah, I'm just trying to sort of really digest the stuff and share it around. So yeah, feel free to check out that. And here are a bunch of links. The specs are pretty dry. They're actually not too badly written. There's sort of interesting how they break it up. There's the sort of base spec, and then there's actually other supporting specs that help if you're a web developer. This is how you might implement it. There's some actually examples of implementing a combo box and all the tabs and all the different widgets. They've gone to a fair bit of effort to share this stuff around.